Hello everyone, I hope you can all hear me. I'd like to welcome you to Death, the City and the Sense of Place, hosted by Wilson Jewish Cemetery. This is part of our Lifeline event, and if you're interested, please visit our website where we have more events like this happening throughout the week. If you have any technical problems, please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and if you have any questions you'd like asked, please use the Q&A function. I'd now like to hand you over to Nadia Valman, who's a reader in English literature at Queen Mary University and currently a teacher of London literature.
Thank you very much, Vicky. And I'm really delighted this evening to welcome three very brilliant writers who all are writers of London Lives and have all published on London Lives in very recently. And they are Guy Gunaratne, whose novel In Our Mad and Furious City was recently published and is set in the locality very close to Wilson Cemetery in Neasden. Howard Jacobson, whose most recent novel, Live a Little, has a crucial scene in a North London cemetery. And Xiao Lu Guo, whose most recent novel, A Lover's Discourse, is just off the press and is concerned in her writing both with a sense of place, but also with a sense of placelessness and rootlessness. So I'm going to be talking about death, a city, and a sense of place over the next hour with these writers, and I hope you'll contribute your questions to the Q&A towards the end. So I want to start with Guy, because Guy's novel is really set so close to the location of the cemetery, but also because I think Guy's a writer for whom the precise evocation of a particular place is really important to his writing. And Guy, the plot of your novel is orchestrated around a particular key location, the ball court at the centre of the Stones estate in Neasden. And I wanted to ask you if you could say more about that location and what you feel it represents.
Thanks, Nadia. And thanks everyone for attending this. This is great to see so many people. Location with Neasden. Well, in a sense, for me, with the structure of the book, the way it's set up, as you sort of alluded to, it follows 5 separate voices, all in first person. And for me, I think about language when I think about locale. London to me has always been about language. The dialect I grew up speaking, sort of loosely termed in academic circles as MLE. It's a socialect. It's a multicultural London English. It's really just a mulch of inherited dialects. And if you're attentive to it, and if you're like me, if you're a language geek, and I just love sort of looking at etymologies and figuring out where the words that are in my mouth come from. MLE is you see it in the dialect of this, really the story of British immigration over the years. So you have smatterings of West Indian patois and Irish and Bengali, and it's all mixed in there. And it really is just quite a dissonance, and it's something for me that I found quite poetic and beautiful, the rhythms of it and the intonation. It's most prevalent really now in the wider culture in grime music. And to me, to approach that and think about that and spend time thinking about it, for me, that was play and being able to place voices like the ones I grew up with alongside where the inheritances came from. So you have older voices in there too, of West Indian patois, Northern Irish dialect, and to place them side by side on the page, to me, it was incredibly exciting. And that's really what I think about when I think about the places that you're talking about, Willesden, Kilburn, Cricklewood, and Neasden. That's what I saw, that's what I heard. And being able to place it on the page, as I say, was fun.
And it's true, isn't it, that also in those languages, in the multicultural London English that the novel speaks in, those dialects, those idiolects also carry histories, don't they? So what you're really demonstrating is the ways in which this place is a place that brings together people's histories, histories that are connected to London in different ways, most of which are violent ways and ways that involve historical struggle. But it's as if the place is also a kind of crucible for all of those histories coming together. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for me, that being able to replay with perspective like that in the book, and place and time as well, right? The sections set in the past, it really sort of allowed me to interrogate and examine the other main key in the book, which is extremism, the proximity to violence. Tracing, I suppose, how words, dialect are inherited, but also social conditioning and trauma at times. The older characters, specifically, one Nelson, who's an older West Indian man, lives in London. He's lived in London since the 50s and came over as a new immigrant during the 50s, during the Notting Hill race riots. And that was an experience, and he speaks to that experience coming over and being confronted, but with that face of Britain. And then the other older voice, Carolyn, who speaks to her experience in Northern Ireland during the Troubles in the 1980s, and having that sort of familial proximity to violence. Being able to really, again, put one voice next to another, one time next to another, you can trace how these things rhyme, not just in the language, but in people's experiences. The words, I suppose, that were used back in the 50s when it comes to sort of fraught topics like this, about around multicultural and the frictions inherent in it and living through it. You're able to trace how the language has changed and has been manipulated somehow, and so the voices that represent that side of Britain that has always been there but are representing them now might not sound exactly like how they sounded back then. Same goes for the resistance to it, but they rhyme, and that was again interesting to me.
Xiaolu, moving on to you, your characters are anything but rooted. They're all through your many novels. We see migrant characters who are very restless, who are looking for a place, who move about, but are often haunted by their places of origin. Can you say a bit more about that for us, please?
Yes. I guess my characters in my novels, especially the London novels I wrote last, say, 15 years, they're all rootlessness. They're looking for a sense of belonging. And I think their relationship to London is it's dispossessed. It's less so confident, less so secure than I think characters in Guy's book or characters in Howard's book. I feel I have this very insecure relationship with London, in a sense when I read, say, the books from Ian Sinclair or Wells Self, especially Ian Sinclair, say one of the books, The Last London, another one is Hackney, The Rosy Empire, because I live in Hackney Central. So really, I live in the heart of the East North in a way, in the city, but I'm always feeling somehow I'm this new arrival, didn't establish this kind of inner language with the place, with the streets. And I let my characters roaming around streets like they were flaneurs. But the sense of flaneur being is so different from in Sinclair or Wells Self's characters. And also I was thinking about, today's discussion, around the cemetery, around the death. All my characters left this country, which is so far away from Europe. And I think for characters or for human beings, when they arrive in the country, there's no trace of the past, or you couldn't find a gravestone of your ancestral or family tree. There's no such thing for you to locate. And that kind of naked living, and if you are in America, if you're in the USA, maybe the sense of you can reinvent or re-establish certain kind of new reality. Therefore, you might gain a piece of graveyard afterlife. But in Europe is something else. I think, for example, in my new novel, A Lover's Discourse, the two characters live on this narrow boat in the canal, which is very close to my house here. And it's Regent's Canal. And the idea of Britain as this narrow boat, and this young man and women live on this boat and perpetually feeling this kind of driftedness, this sense of just belonging and this kind of perpetual searching for some kind of roots. But the idea of the boats on the canal and this kind of post-industrial melancholic landscape somehow invites them to, to ask a question: is this rootable? If this word exists rootable, something like that, is this a place, for some kind of, the fundamental, the final belong, such thing exists for the characters. So often in my books, the Chinese character and the Western character have this intense debate about the home and the sense of belonging. And I think the love relationship between the man and the woman is really the question of home or sustainable future, an idea of human relation being sustained in certain geographical location. And I remember when I came to London a long time ago, 18 years ago, the first cemetery I went was not this one, Wellston one. I was in the Highgate cemetery. And a really strange, a foreigner, a Chinese, in relation to the Western idea of the cemetery, So I think the first gravestone I did recognize was from Karl Marx. It was Karl Marx gravestone, and with his inscription. And since I grew up in a very communist home environment, and I suddenly lots of things making sense. Okay, so it's not about, it's not the national identity. Cemetery is something else. It's also to do with exile and immigration. But that was the very first idea. Suddenly, I thought about the idea of exile, my own kind of voluntary state of exile from China. And I guess for all my writings, cemetery, the memories is like a cemetery with the fragments you can recognize and some fragments you cannot recognize. And the inscription on each gravestone will send you somewhere in a deep memory, yet some are buried, in this deep place. So it's quite interesting, real and a metaphorical discussion, really.
Thank you. I want to move on to Howard now and also kind of pose the same question to him about, actually all of your novels, Howard, have a very strong sense of where the characters are coming from locationally, most often suburbs. And in Live a Little, we have a very strong sense of Swiss Cottage and Finchley Road in particular as a location and as a location with its particular ethos. So I wanted to ask you whether you think there's a particular sensibility associated with Finchley Road, Swiss Cottage. Why you chose that location for Live a Little.
Well, it chose me, really. This is the usual fancy thing that writers say, but I think it's true. I didn't see them until I saw where they were, these characters. I don't normally see a character. I certainly don't feel I possess a character until I've got a sense of their place. Because once you've got a sense of their place, you've got how they will talk and how they feel about various things and how they dress and how they move. The ironical idea, the idea that made me feel I was really cooking with gas with this novel was I thought they're very elderly people. So they're living in a place which is full of memories for them. They don't really inhabit it fully now. The central character, who is the woman, almost doesn't go out that much. And although the man does and goes wandering around, he's not really seeing the place. But they live opposite each other. That was the great joke. They don't meet until they're about 90, and they meet in the cemetery. You've already mentioned that. And then they have to go to a cemetery to discover that they're living just across the road from each other. And I liked that idea. It is not a place that I know from, this is not a place of my roots. I too, though this is not a competition, I too am in exile. I'm in exile from Manchester, which might not sound very dramatic exile, but there's a big difference between Manchester and London. And there's particularly a big difference between Manchester Jews and London Jews. As a Manchester Jew, my friends and I were always ironical about London Jews, who seemed to us wide boys, a little bit too smart, too well dressed. Their pronunciations of Yiddish were wrong. They talked about motze when it should be matzah. They didn't know how to they said it was a beigel, whereas of course it's a bagel. We had a sense that they were not proper Jews. We were proper Jews from Manchester. So when I've lived in London half my life, but I feel sort of exiled in it. I feel very much a Mancunian in London. But whether I felt a Mancunian in Manchester is another thing. I think I started writing out of. I think the exile feeling is what makes writers of us all. That's what kicks it off. I think if you don't feel exiled, you're not going to be a writer, really. If you're a happy person at home in your world, I don't think you're ever going to write poems or a novel. You'd be a footballer or an advertising executive, or you'll go to broadcasting or something. The novelists are made out of that sense of being ill at ease in the world and not convinced that the world that they're living in is even a real world. I could say that Manchester is my homeland, and certainly, you know, my most vivid memories of being alive, really, of being a little boy, aged 5 or 6, and holding hands with my grandma, who spoke Yiddish, who took me around this little shtetl-y part of Manchester, which was called Hightown, and to all intents and purposes could have been Poland. But as I wandered around with her, I thought, this is not quite my place. This is odd. I had that sense that I needed to record this somewhere or other, the strangeness of this place, because a lot of people didn't speak any English. The roads didn't look like, in my imagination, I see muddy roads, but there couldn't have been muddy roads. There weren't horses and carts going around the streets of central Manchester. But that's almost how it feels now in my mind, because it felt foreign to me then. But if that was foreign to me, then where was I? Where was home? So later on, I discovered that side of my family from which my grandmother came from was Lithuania. And when I went to Lithuania, that looked very much like the high town of Manchester that I'd grown up in. And there the roads were indeed, some of them, muddy. But I didn't feel I was from Lithuania either. So it's as if there is a kind of a multiplicity, an accretion of exiles. Which is one of the advantages of being Jewish, that you can feel you've got the back they go. And how far back do they go? Well, you know, I know how far back they go. I was at the bottom of that mountain when Moses came down with the tablets. That was sort of more or less where it started. But even then, the other people I was with at the bottom of that mountain were complaining, and they were fed up of Moses, and they were sick of the religion that Moses was bringing them, and they were doing what people who won't honor the lockdown are doing now. They were dancing around the golden calf and not respecting social distance. So it's as though there's an endless journey backwards, finding where you, if you are a writer, an endless journey backwards, finding where you come from. And God help you, really, as a writer, if you ever find it.
Guy, I want to go back to the location and the very intense sense we have in your novel of the geography of the estate that you write about. There's a sense not only, I mean, you've talked very interestingly about the Neason estate being a kind of place of language, your interest began with language. But there's also a huge amount of detail that really evokes what it feels like, what the geography of the neighborhood feels like, what it's like to be on top of a tower block, what it's like to be down in that ball court. What sort of details are you thinking about when you're placing characters in a location?
Oh, that's difficult craft stuff. I'm just never good at craft questions. It's all very particularly at the beginning. It's apparently it's very instinctive or intuitive at the beginning. You just sort of feel through. It's a terrible answer to give. It's not very helpful, but it's really how I saw it. I grew up around those areas. So that, the lady with the Asda bag, or the kid who's writing something on a bus stop window. All those things for me, I'm sort of singing in my head as I think back, and it's sort of tainted, I was going to say, but it's got a bit of nostalgia along these memories. They're not quite rose tinted, but they're difficult memories. But along with that, the way they kind of appear when I'm writing tends to be I don't know, heightened somehow. The details come along as they do. I'm not sure how I think about it, but they do just end up there. It's not the best answer, I'm sorry.
I want to pick up though on the idea of memory, because it occurs to me that all of your novels, the characters in all of your novels, landscape and locality kind of come into meaning, especially when characters are aging. And for Howard, it's this kind of very strange experience of a place where the place itself has changed, but memory loss also has affected their relationship to the place. But also, I think, Guy, in your novel, that sense of longing for a lost place that the older generation of migrants feel. And I think Xiaolu also, that sense of, in your most recent novel, the character goes back to China and her village is entirely transformed. So the landscape that was once hers is no longer there. That memory is erased. Would any of you like to comment on that sense of the changing significance of landscape and location for characters in the life cycle?
I wish I could actually read the actual page about memory and architecture, because a male character in my book, in The Lover's Discourse, is a landscape architect. And I think it took me a while to decide what his background, his job is for the novel. And there's a kind of internal dialogue going on between the man and woman when she is in China. And she asks, what is the final art? What is the answer for our memory? And as if he is answering to her, even though he's not there in China, he's in Europe, he's in London, and he answers, well, architecture is a memory, is the answer of our human marks, the places we occupied, the memories we created. And then she's saying, in that page, in that monologue, but what is that memory? For the memories can be politicized, can be changed completely, can be rewritten in a propaganda system by the political force. And she's saying, the memory of her childhood is buffaloes, rice fields, this landscape. But then her renewed memory is these ring roads, this powerful factory kind of streamlined, the powerful kind of industry, the modern city, the urban force. And that somehow still takes away her older memory, and then renewing again her immigrant memory of West London. So that's a page of discussion, where we locate our memory through architecture, through actual space and geography.
I think that's interesting. I think the architecture for my characters is internal architecture. Most of my characters very much live in their heads and don't notice that much outside. And what they do, the changes that they do notice are human changes. So-and-so had a shop here. So-and-so had a business here. This was a place where we used to meet and have a drink or have coffee, and it's not here anymore. So that the changes to a city are recorded humanly like that and lived through in the interiority of the characters. They live so, I've never set out to do this, it's just for some reason that's what my characters are like. But they live so intensely in their heads that it makes for a very, very particular kind of passion when they encounter each other. So when my old protagonists meet, both 90 now, in a cemetery, and embark on what is, to all intents and purposes, a love affair, it's a love affair of the inside of their heads. They get very, very close inside each other. They look deep into each other's eyes, and they almost swap places. I'm sure this is, a psychologist would say this is a very unhealthy thing to do, but it makes them extremely interested in each other. And it means they have an awful lot to say to each other, because they're not looking outward. They're only looking inward at themselves and therefore at each other. And it makes for a very, if you can be solipsistic, they're solipsists together. And it might be that put two solipsists in a room, and if they're equally matched as solipsists, you have a recipe for an intense love affair.
That's so interesting. Just to draw on what Xiaolu and Howard have said, the memory thing is, it strikes me now that a lot of my feeling for the place in terms of the particular locale, so Cricklewood Broadway, for example. When I was younger, the first experience of learning about the place I was from was at the back seat of my dad's car. My dad, who'd come over in the 50s, is like a brand new immigrant at 17, would sort of recount the changes of the place as he was driving through it. He'd say, well, that Cricklewood Broadway used to, the sort of immigrant Irish labourers used to stand outside the Crown pub waiting for the van, but now now they're Eastern European immigrant labourers, and all that shop wasn't a Polish butcher's. Back then it was an Irish pool house, and all these stories kind of came together, and this was my experience of it. And strangely, as Howard described, sort of the lineage of where he's from, the idea of where I'm from has come. I think about the immigrant voyage as so that collective sense of change or reconstitution, identities built through just as much of a mulch as the language that we speak. That's where the sense of who I am comes from. It isn't so much rooted in land or motherlands, Sri Lanka, for example, which is where my parents are from. It's really rooted in that story, that voyage of change and re-establishing, renewing each time. And it speaks to what Xiaolu said about that sense of I forget the word you used, but in my head I hear unbelonging. The idea of being out of place. But strangely enough, the feeling of the younger characters in my book, and I guess this really speaks to my own experience of being able to refuse what you yourself has been denied. Being okay with unbelonging then, if it means buying into a narrative that my history has never been a part of. That to me is always interesting. It's a liminal space. It's somewhere in between that allows me to speak to different experiences with a sense of not being claimed by either. So therefore, I'm able to self-criticize and say things perhaps that people who would like to also belong to where I'm from would want me to say.
I would like to add maybe one little thing about how I see a city is multicultural city or a big city, a proper big city like New York, London, or Paris or Berlin, is to investigate its cemetery. And I think I have this fascination going through different cemeteries in different cities to see, often a very big city has incredible international list in the cemetery. And that's how I feel in London, in Berlin, and especially in Paris. The trace back such a past that bring the whole history of, not in this national sense, you know, it's from the whole world, and exile, the immigrants, very interesting. So many stories in the cemetery. Yeah.
Yes, if you want to get to the living heart of a city, go to a cemetery.
It's so interesting, Xiaolu, because also in A Lover's Discourse, the point where the narrator starts to think about her parents' own death and the scene of her parents' grave in the cemetery in China, she's actually on the canal in London. Can you say something about why the landscape of the canal is linked in that way to death in the cemetery?
Yeah, I would have read that section from the book. I mean, the idea is, this is a very sad kind of example in China. The cemetery, there's a lot of cemeteries because we have the biggest population in the world. But a lot of cemeteries, they are brand new. You know, if it's 5 years old, this cemetery is old cemetery because they have to keep building a lot of new cemetery, even though, you know, the actual burials now are allowed. We use the same system, the ashes, But in the book, the character's father buried in the very brand new cemetery is vast, is huge, enormous. So they had to open the gate, allow 4 lanes of truck and cars to get in, you know, with whatever coffin or that. It's huge. So it's a huge city inside of cemetery. And I think that's my idea of cemeteries in China, and especially in countryside. You know, they're the place. The countryside is a place providing the dead, the place for the dead. And when I came to London, it is probably old. You know, the cemetery I went, they're very old, and in Paris, really old. And it made me wonder about, you know, a personal relationship to the city, to your family. And for some years, I escaped London, lived in Berlin. And my apartment in front of the biggest Jewish cemetery, synagogue, in Prenzlauberg, in Kowitzplatz. And I think you would know very well, that's very big Jewish cemetery. I can look from my window. And I often ask myself when I live in Berlin, do I belong there? You know, is there anything I can share with this massive old Jewish cemetery? And it's often very sorrowful when you think about the roots, the past, how you can invent a new route, you know, here, you know, in front of the old roots. So the territory and occupation, you know, instant kind of connection from the dead place, right? Sorry, my answer is very elusive.
No, it's really interesting. I mean, I want to carry on talking about death, and also to ask Guy, really, in relation to, I suppose, novel writing, because one thing that novels do is they narrativize death. They make meaning out of the deaths of protagonists, and the kind of climax of Guy's novel is the death of one of the narrators, who, as a reader, you can become very close to. So I wanted to ask him, you know, what do you think the novel? What did you want to do in terms of sort of making meaning of that tragic death of a young man, in many ways a very mundane death of which has happened to many young men in cities?
I think his death came out of a consequence of him being compelled by forces that in a city like London, which is an extreme city in itself, in many different ways. His death, I think, for me, seemed inevitable from almost the first inklings of the story, the idea that I was going to tell this sort of multi-voiced novel. He's compelled by various different forces, quite directly, religious extremism, but also this sense of feeling as if the experience of growing up within a multicultural city and an immediate locale like Neasden, which is intensely multicultural, and has been over generations. Being forced in one sense to lay claim to his sort of past in terms of his religious identity, or you know, the family he is from, versus this very multivarious, very fluid experience as a young man living in London in the 90s and the early 2000s. It isn't perhaps immediate to people that these two things are incredibly fraught. I mean, I up as well in terms of what is almost an ancient inheritance, and what that does to a sense of identity, and it is exacerbated by the idea of extremes. In terms of the writing, all I can really think to is, I've spoken to a lot of other writers who've just started out, and they wonder whether a death, or having a death in a film, a novel, would be somehow limiting. For me, it was freeing. It allowed me to play with that particular voice in a way that I couldn't play with the other voices, particularly in terms of the poetry and what I could really get away with in terms of how this young man's sort of expression, what it could do. And in the end, it sort of ended up being, the novel does have 5 voices, but it's bookended with his main voice, but it's also more, maybe a collective voice of all of their voices together. And for me, knowing that, you know, well, he's speaking from the dead, so I could get away with it, can't I? It allowed me to play more, I think.
Thank you. And so Howard, as you've already mentioned, your novel, the key meeting of the two protagonists takes place in a cemetery. Then there's a funeral where it all begins, where the family secrets start to be unraveled. But you are a comic writer. Tragedy is, I suppose, ever present in one sense, but also comedy is your medium. So can you say something about what comedy has to tell us about death?
Yes,
what death has to tell us about comedy.
If I am a comic writer, then death is even more omnipresent. Nothing brings death to your mind more than comedy, I think. One of the great scenes in literature, and it's kind of formative for me. I read it when I was a teenager, and I thought this is a tester. Is the great graveyard scene in Hamlet, which everybody knows. I mean, it's full of the poetry of death, of fear of death. It's got a whole series of attitudes to death. There's the kind of the gross inurement of the gravediggers who feel nothing, a Hamlet who feels too much. You feel Horatio in the middle who thinks, well, you're feeling a bit too much here. Hamlet says to him, do you think, am I overdoing it now? And Horatio says, I think you are actually. To consider too curiously, my lord, calm it down. And then we keep thinking, no, Hamlet's right. You know, of course it makes you feel like this. And then in the middle of this scene, the grave diggers are digging things up, and they throw up a skull, and it's a jester's skull. Not for nothing. Shakespeare knows what he's doing. In the middle of all this death and mayhem, there's a comedian, a dead comedian, but is a comedian. And Hamlet famously talks to the skull, remembers what the comedian was like, how he entertained everybody, what a great comedian he was. And then he says, get thee to my lady's chamber. Tell her to paint an inch thick. To this favor, in other words, to look like you, to this favor must she come. The most terrible, the most terrible fate that inevitable but terrible, and terrible because inevitable, that awaits us all. No matter what we do to make ourselves beautiful, to believe in life, this is what we are beneath the paint. This is the skull beneath the paint. And then there's a pause, or at least in my head I hear a pause. And Hamlet says, make her laugh at that. And that's a chill that makes you go, oh, strange, because that's the challenge to the jester, to the comedian, alive or dead. If your comedy is going to be worth a sou, if it's going to be worth anything at all, You've got to be able to make people laugh at, otherwise it's nothing. Making people laugh at what's happy is nothing, but making people laugh is valuable if you can make them laugh, whatever that means, give them some kind of purchase, give them some sense of meaning, even if it's the meaning of the, the utterly irrational at this thing. So that what this great scene makes you feel if you're a comic writer, or rather what this great scene does is it makes you a comic writer, I would say, because you then realize everything is yours now. The most serious things are yours. Your subject is not limited to people falling over a banana skin or people making witty dialogue in a drawer. Your territory as the comic writer, your territory as the comic writer is the most serious stuff there is. That doesn't mean that you then, I don't think, I've written a lot of cemetery scenes and certainly a lot of burials. They're not quite the same thing. You can have a quiet melancholy meander through a cemetery, which I like to do as we all do. And then you have the business of the burying, with people coming together, and where the cemetery becomes, a site of, a moral site, really, a site of moral reckoning. This is where the people who've lived lives in relation to that dead person must face who they are, and so on. And I can't leave them alone. I think all my last 6 novels have either begun with or ended with a cemetery scene. And now in Live a Little, it's in the very middle. And it's pivotal, because that, if you like, that is the moment, the cemetery is the moment when life starts for 2 90-year-olds. It should be where life finishes, but it's where, and particularly when you're 90, but it's where life starts for them. And it's almost as if, and I think that's funny, but I certainly wasn't laughing about it when I wrote it, but it struck me as deeply funny that here you are, and you will gather your sustenance and you will gather your belief in the future from the fact that there is none.
I think that's a great moment for us to open up to questions from our viewers, our audience. So if you'd like to ask a question to our writers, please type it in the Q&A panel of Zoom, which is at the bottom of your screen. And I will field questions to the panelists. And while we're waiting for people to have their thoughts on this, I do want to ask a question of all of you, which is about, I think it's been mentioned, which is about orthodoxy. Yes, Guy picked up this earlier, but it's all of you are writers whose characters are grappling in some way with orthodoxies of various kinds, whether that be religious orthodoxies or regimes, totalitarian regimes. I was thinking about this because Willesden Cemetery is an Orthodox cemetery, Orthodox Jewish cemetery, but many of the things that, many of the burial practices that have been done there are different in many ways from other Orthodox cemeteries. So it's a place both of orthodoxy and also a kind of experimentation or a kind of newness. Would any of the writers like to comment on the idea and the importance of struggles with orthodoxy in their writing?
Well, I'll say something. Sorry, I just feel I've just finished
No, go ahead.
A soliloquy, so that would belong. But when I see Orthodox families out walking on a Friday night, going to synagogue or coming back, I feel a pang of, it's not nostalgia because I never had Orthodoxy, but I feel it's almost a nostalgia going back a long, long way when I might once have been in whichever place I once came from, have been like that. I feel some sort of affection for them. And when I hear fellow Jews, liberal Jews, university Jews, my friends, sneering at the orthodoxy, it depresses me, because I don't think you should. I think you should be interested in the other aspects of who you are. Because it's as though you're saying what you might have been. But on the other hand, I do feel very much that that for a Jew, orthodoxy is a kind of contradiction. The Orthodox won't feel that. The Orthodox would feel, I'm not a Jew. I want to say to the Orthodox, don't you understand, you're not really Jewish. That's not really Jewish, because what we do is we argue. We don't obey, we argue. We say no to God. We respect God, yeah, we respect God, but we say no. And I think, so I want to say to them, I think God likes me more as a Jew than he likes you as a Jew, because I'm heterodox. And therefore, as someone heterodox and full of disputatiousness and argument and wondering and questioning, I am the true religious person. This doesn't go down very well.
I have a question here from Ron Finley, who asks, do Jalu and Guy agree with Howard that exile maketh the writer?
Probably I just take the question, yeah, right away. So Guy, you can think. For me, it is. It's been outsider, so I guess you can be a very rooted Londoner, have sense of this entity, this kind of property entity, the togetherness from the history of your family or your narrative. But still, if you're outside of the system, then you are in this internal exile. And I think in my situation is both. Is really, there's a faraway system out there in China, and I had to leave. And then this system here in Britain, I felt for a long, long time, I felt very isolated and being alone. And this alienness really created my writing. But come back to Howard's speech just a few minutes ago. It's very interesting for me, for someone outside of this classical religious debate. Well, you can see I don't belong to any classical debate around religions, but I felt if anything can be inclusive, then I have much more respect for that debate. If that thing is so exclusive, then I'm outside. Then I'm perpetual outside. You know, so whether it's Jewishness or the debate about Muslim or debate about something else, you know, I felt the key is inclusiveness, and that invites the new generation. And I think the problem with religious discussion is become so, you know, push more and more people out from that supposed pure land.
No, I think I agree. I think about Bellow. So he his sort of insistence that he was entirely Jewish and entirely American at the same time, and you can see that on the page. Again, the ancient influence, but also very much about living in the street in Chicago. And for me, that was a tremendous influence and inspiration. I think it goes back to what Howard said about just really not denying your own multiplicities, and being able to express them with contradiction, and not being afraid of that. This is a writer called Nicholas Sporiard who speaks about this idea of the radicant, which is a sort of a biology term. A radicant is ivy is a type of radicant which doesn't really gain sustenance from a single root, but reroots itself, and this is how it spreads and flourishes. That to me is an idea is clung into my head in terms of a mode of being, or constantly in a mode of becoming, as something very attractive, particularly for a writer. So perhaps I do agree entirely with Howard.
I have a question that is firstly to Howard and then to the other two panelists, which refers to the Cosmo Cafe, which appears under a pseudonym in his novel. And the question is, to some extent, the Cosmo Cafe, which was in Finchley Road, caused the Jewish community in Swiss Cottage to be cohesive. So I guess it was a kind of location of cohesion. And the question is, what creates a community in a novel?
Or creates a community in a novel. Well, I don't know how to answer that. You could say the novelist creates the community in a novel, except I'm very against the idea that the novelist does anything. And I like the idea of the novelist standing by. I'm with both writers here that, you watch it form, you watch it take place. I don't know what I don't know what the question means. Do you have to have a community in a novel?
Maybe, I suppose.
Cara, do you understand that question? Bearing of that question?
Maybe I could just direct it a bit, because it seems to me it's saying something. It's asking an interesting question about what kind of vessels you use within a novel to express forms of community. So I think, for example, in Guy's novel, it clearly is the place that brings together these very diverse people, and they all belong in some way to the place, but they come from elsewhere. They come from many elsewheres. It's the place that produces what we might call a community. I mean, perhaps that's the question, or that might be a way to answer to ask the question differently.
All right, then very briefly, yes. And I think if that's what the question means, then I apologise for being slow and not getting. Then I have an answer. Memory. It's memory, the shared memory of who they've all been, what their parents were, the shared memory of themselves when they were younger. And because this is a novel about forgetting as much as remembering, one of the characters is losing memory. The other character can't forget anything. And there's a terrible morbidity about the not being able to forget anything, to the point where you feel that forgetting would be a blessed release if only one could forget. So I think it's that. I think it is both obsessive memory and the fear of losing memory that bring people together. In this novel anyway, yes.
Mm.
Xiaolu and Guy, would either of you like to respond to the question?
I guess in my case, it's more play with the linguistic identities. So, of course, no novelist would claim I want to represent a group. But on the other hand, the collective memory, which is going through a certain linguistic identity, and then any writer adopt a trick, a device for a novel, for a narrative. Every book we invented, we have to have some sort of device, an interesting trick, intellectual or conventional. And I think with me is repetitively this obsession of a character represent a certain kind of linguistic identity and try to steal the other's language, and the others the language, the system often is Anglophone character. In, for example, Lover's Discourse, he's Anglophone German character. So he found his language has this erosion or through time, being eaten or being hijacked, So she spoke his language, and he tried to reflect on his roots through the linguistic identity, and again through, how it said, memory of the place. I think that's the trick I'm doing, most of the time.
Yeah, and briefly, I think it's funny. I draw a blank, and then Xiaolu and Howard speak, and suddenly I'm like, oh yes, no, this is full credit to both of you and Nadia. I think that what brings a lot of the characters together, I think, is part of the reason I wanted to write the book, was to confront perhaps what we share with each other as human beings that we'd rather not. So things like the compulsion towards extremes. Each character in the book has to confront a version of their own extremism. I think that what kicked off the novel itself was a terrorist attack in London, and since then, every time one of these attacks happen across Europe or anywhere else, the image of the young man usually is flashed up on screen, and quite understandably, the disassociation takes place, which is oh well, okay, paint that person as a monster, and it is other to us, whether that be a nation or a society or a community. Never mind the fact that they grew up just like perhaps I would have grown up in the kind of community that we all live in. Suddenly, the act of acting upon their compulsion makes them inhuman. And for me, what connects all the characters in this book is the difficult thought that perhaps we're all implicated in that same human weakness.
I have a question here from Adam, which is asking about how you write about belonging and also unbelonging in particular neighborhoods. So what are your thoughts on your writing about neighborhoods and the kinds of boundaries they draw around, I guess, around communities, as you've been talking about? So that's a question for everybody.
I'm sure I'll think of something as soon as everyone else starts speaking.
Xiaolu, I suppose in some ways you've been alluding to this earlier, the sense of this kind of the metropolis, the London as this city in which no one belongs. There's, I mean, there's really a sense in your novels that are set in all different neighborhoods of London, but actually there's a very similar feeling in the protagonist, who often comes from somewhere else and is longing for that lost place, or feels unrooted, doesn't feel that there are ways into belonging.
Yeah, I think that my characters are often, this kind of central victim of literature influence. So when a character comes from, say, Japan, China, or Vietnam, she grew up with the European literature. So her idea of London should resemble somehow, let's say, if not Jane Austen, but Dickens or Shakespeare or something from her literary reading list, or her idea of Paris would resemble, the books from Sartre's book, or Marguerite Duras, or America, New York City should be, from Kerouac or Ginsberg. So I think this is complete cut off from the reality. Yeah, when you grow up with literature and with visual representation, say Hollywood cinema, it's such an illusion, powerful illusion you construct in your head. And then when you come to this actual place, it's not really about disappointment. It's a disconnection with the reality, and which is so rooted from the literary art reference. And I think for artists, for writers, is very powerful, because you can write about that. Misunderstanding is even a weak vocabulary. Let's say, about just the alienation between the imagination and the actuality, of everyday life.
Would either of the other panelists like to respond to the question? No. If you don't have anything to add, that's fine. We can move on to the next question.
I think about almost a motif in the book where the younger characters, because there's not much around them in their immediate surroundings that allows them to think of possibilities beyond it. This is something I think about and grown up with, and perhaps there are people who are attending now that are from Neasden. Neasden's not. I've described it with some affection as a nowhere place. It's sort of cleaved open by a dual carriageway. People drive through to get to the IKEA. No one really sticks around or stays, and so the sense of community is a difficult one in a place like that. And many places around London and elsewhere are similar. There's a motif in the book where the young characters, because of that sense, they begin to look upwards at the sky, at something that's clear of sort of grayness, sort of dull facades of buildings. And I think for me, it's not particularly in the book, but for me that meant literature and reading beyond my current surroundings. My growing up as someone who went through school and very much influenced from music of Black origin and reading American Jewish writers and really kind of getting a sense of my place in the world that isn't so much rooted in belonging to Neasden per se, but belonging to a wider fellowship, I suppose, of artists. That to me was a lonely existence, but it's one that sustained me for a bit.
Yeah, it's funny, listening to other writers, you think you've got nothing to say, and then you're immediately sparked by all the good things they say. It just occurred to me very briefly that a lot of my novels are about kids growing up, and what binds a community of kids very much is what they're reading, what they're watching, and also language. one of my novels I wrote is full of the slang, bits of street slang, market slang, because all our fathers were market tradesmen, because, you know, there was no possibility of them earning a living any other way. So we had the fairground slang, bits of Yiddish slang, and the whole sense of community of kids was that. You know, how much slang did we know? The idea that when we spoke to one another in that lingo, we held out and everybody else. So it made a kind of, kept out everybody else. So it was a kind of an exclusiveness built on slang. What's in Live a Little, where there's nobody of that kind of age in sight. It's a much sadder thing. And community in Live a Little is what they remember. Community is what they remembered it once was. The past. The community is the past. And the tragedy of the novel, what made this a sad, very upsetting novel to write, and I hope in the best sense, an upsetting novel to read, is that sense that something's gone and everybody's trying. So everybody is bravely. The men are trying to dress all right so that they don't show the signs of ravages. The women are bravely looking after themselves. This is the kind of bravery of aging. That's my community in this novel, a community of the bravely aging.
We have to say goodbye to Xiaolu now because she has another commitment. So I'm going to say goodbye and thank you to her. But we do have another question that we'll continue with afterwards. But thank you very much to Xiaolu.
See you next time. Thank you.
Thanks, Xiaolu.
Lovely.
So the question I have here to Guy and Howard asks, can place be used as an effective character in itself?
I almost want to answer for Guy, because as Guy has described his work, then I think it obviously is in his work. I don't know whether you would quite put it as your ambition to do that, but you've made that sense of place come very alive as a character in.
Well, that's the thing. I think that, I don't know if it was the intention. Perhaps lots of people have said this, but I never really thought about that I didn't honestly think about a lot of in terms of my intention of what I meant for the book. I'm not sure if you would either, but that seems to have been what emerges. Yeah.
I think that's a wonderful way to end this discussion, because in a way it opens up what a writer does in writing a novel is not always what they intend. There's much more that is revealed and comes out of what they've done with their materials. So I'd like to say an enormous thank you to Xiaolu, who's just left us, but also to Guy and to Howard for this incredibly rich and wide-ranging discussion. I hope you'll visit Willesden Jewish Cemetery and reflect on some of the things that we've been thinking about this evening, but also I hope you'll read these novels.
Thank you very much, Nadia,
you,
and thank you to all our panelists. I hope everyone you've enjoyed the discussion today. It's been really amazing, so thank you to everyone involved. I just want to say quickly, as you leave, you will then later receive an email survey, and we really appreciate you filling out these surveys, because as part of the National Lottery Heritage Project, we are always collecting evaluation and feedback, so please fill those out for us. Thank you. I'd also like to just direct you back to our website, which is www.willesdenjewishcemetery.org.uk. As I said at the beginning, we have a load of events still going on this week, and you can find out more there and book your place there. And also please do visit us. We opened officially on Monday, and our opening times are on the website. So I hope to see you all soon. And I hope you have an amazing time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.